So, of course, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about releasing designs in Onshape. So, this webinar is going to be very much different than a lot of the webinars we do in the sense that we're really not going to do a lot of CAD, so to speak, but more talk about the management of the CAD data that we created in Onshape. So, more specifically, how do we manage that release process with our CAD data? And the reason we're bringing this up now is it's just a frequently asked question. A lot of users are really starting to dig into it and start to want to manage their processes a little bit better. How do we manage the different states of a design? How do we manage the permissions associated with it? And especially when we start getting into larger organizations where release management is a really big thing. So again, the goal today isn't so much to show you CAD, but to show you how we would manage some of this, all this data that we're creating in Onshape. Now, the key thing I want to stress here is, we're putting this together just because of just sheer requests, the number of users asking us, hey, we'd like to see how we think this should be done. But I want to stress this is something that we're actively working on, right? So this is an area of Onshape that we're actively working to improve. So a lot of what I'm going to show you here today may not always be this way. I want to stress this. We're doing this live. It's October 10th, 2017. There's a chance that a lot of what I'm showing you here today won't apply, in the near future. And that's just because of the nature of Onshape. We update so often. This is an area of focus for us. And so I want to stress that if you came to me today and said, I have a design in Onshape, I would want to know how you recommend handling the release management of it. This is what I would recommend. But know that, this is going to change in the near future. So again, the topic is releasing designs, the process of release management, and how we could accomplish those kinds of things in Onshape. Now, a few things, of course, we're going to start with the agenda. I want to discuss common workflows. And the reason I use the word workflows is I think a lot of users that are talking about release management have some kind of experience with a PDM level workflow. Workflows or literally a flow chart of your process, so to speak, is can be referred to as a workflow. I want to show you a common one, but of course, the thing with workflows is, you could go to 10 different companies and see 10 different workflows. It's really dependent on the organization and how they want to manage their data. But there are a few things that most of them share, and we will go through examples of how to do those. But again, I want to stress, I realize, this is something that's very unique to every organization. The neat thing is you can set these things up, and I'll go through that in just a bit. So we're going to discuss a few common workflows, just an example workflow that I think a lot of companies kind of share. And then I want to get into properties, permissions, teams, state of the document, of parts, of assemblies, the key things that you're going to need in order to successfully manage, releasing a design. And that's really the key, is it's a combination of assigning a state, adding any kind of properties that may go with it, like revision, for example, and then managing the permission, either via Teams or not, depending on the size of your organization. So states, properties, permissions, teams, those are all important things when we talk about releasing designs in Onshape. And of course, I want to show you just a simple example from start to finish. I create a document, I share it with the necessary people, it starts in that in progress phase, and then we go through how we would version it, how we would change the state, the revision, and so on. All right, so let's jump into it now. Again, this is an area that's going to vary depending on who you talk to. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a really company-specific thing. So again, I want to stress, I know yours may not look exactly like this, but I think, a lot of companies have, some of this in common. And generally, when you think of a workflow of a common organization, it starts with some kind of a in progress, kind of quote unquote sandbox state where the engineers can do all the design work without, it being visible to anyone else. It's kind of their place to work, so to speak. And that's where all designs by default start in Onshape. And for those not aware, we do have state as a default property in each of your documents. So when you create a new document now, you have that option for state, and it always starts in the in progress state, which is generally that first step in the process. Now, again, the names can vary. You may have a first step before it gets to that point. Those little things, again, can vary, but in general, engineers have that first place where they want to work, right? That initial state. Now, after the design has matured and it's reached a point where it's ready to be reviewed by someone, management, some other team, then it goes into a different state. And that state could be called pending, could be called review, could be, there's a number of different things. Waiting for approval is another common one that I've seen. But it's generally just a review state where it sits in a state until someone stamps their approval on that state, right? And then it moves from that review state, that pending state, into some kind of a released state. And generally that means this is a product that's out in the market, and we do not want to make changes to it without some kind of a formal change process, change order, sometimes referred to as ECO, engineering change order. And that process could involve, creating an ECN number. It could involve a number of different things depending on your organization and how you want to handle that change order process. But in general, a released design is not touched, so to speak. It's not changed. That's what is the latest quote unquote released design that's out in the market, out in production. And so it requires some kind of a change order in order to go back for a new revision, if that's how you choose to capture it. Revision's a good way to. And so if I have product and I have revision A and I go to market with it, and then a year later we decide we're going to make some changes, that would then warrant an ECO back to the in progress state where I can make my design changes, have it approved, and then it would bump to revision B, right? So this is kind of what I would call a common overall workflow. I know there's going to be little tangents of every company has their own variations of this, but I think a lot of them share these steps. And the question then becomes, well, how would you do this in Onshape? How do I take this process that I'm used to and push it into an Onshape document, right? Where maybe I've done this with files in the past, managing files. And so the answer is, we're assigning a state and revision property as part of the version process. So for design revisions, whether it be just a single part or the entire document or an assembly within it, you would create a version. And in that version, you would assign the state and you would assign a revision if it's changing, right? So it's an important part of the process of versioning. And an important part of all we're talking about in release designs here is creating those versions and capturing that metadata, right? The state, the revision, they're just properties within the document that we can adjust as we're creating those versions. Now, how would you restrict the access to the documents based on their state? That's a manual step as of today, done via the CAD administrator. And so the role that we've seen, that the successful strategies that we've seen, is the CAD administrator creates a new document, right? Initially, they only have access to it, and they define, who has access via Teams and what kind of access, view or edit. And then once a design is versioned, right, that revision is changed, or if it's just, capturing a state change, then the permissions are adjusted based on that. Right, and that's a CAD administrator role. Now, a commonly asked question is, do we have a way to automate that? So if I change the state, will it automatically change the permissions of the document and so on? The answer is no, not today. I will say again that this is an area that we're working on. So just realize we want to improve this process. We're going to in the near future. But as of today, the CAD administrator would need to go in and edit the permissions of the document, change it to view only once it's hit that released state, for example. All right, so what does this look like in practice? Well, the key thing I would stress is, pretend that I'm the role of the CAD administrator. One of the first things I would do is create my new project create my new document for my new project. So I go to create, we'd create a new document, and of course, it's going to be owned by the company. Very important step. I, as the CAD admin, that's going to default to me, of course. And I can just say, this is a company-owned document, right? So we have our new project. I've created a company-owned document. I hit OK, and now I'm off and running. Now, as I mentioned before, everything that we do inside of a document starts off in that initial in-progress state. Now, forgive me for the quick, sloppy modeling here. I'm going to extrude a quick cylinder just so we have a part. And the thing I wanted to show is in the workspace properties, right? So in your document under workspace properties, you'll find all the properties that we can edit, right? So if I start expanding out the workspace, get into that part, you can see name, description, part number, revision, state, vendor, project, all these other various properties that are associated with, in this case, this part. The same goes for the assembly. So I can left click the assembly. I have name, description, part number, revision, state, vendor, and so on. Now, I think for releasing designs, the two that are most important are going to be, of course, revision and state, at least commonly. And so, as I'm releasing a design, I might change the revision depending on where I'm at. And of course, I might change the state. If I'm releasing it, it's not going to be in progress. I'm going to change that to released. Now, one very important thing I want to stress is when you're editing these properties, you notice I just went to workspace properties and I launched this, and I can edit all of these properties except for state, right? And so just keep in mind, state, you can only change the state of an established version, not the active workspace, right? So generally, you're going to adjust this as you create a version. As a practice, when you create a new version of your document, you're going to go in and change the state to match that, to whatever it happens to be in. But that's why it's grayed out here. I'm not creating a version, right? I'm just editing the workspace properties. So revision, part number, description, all those things are fine, but you cannot change the state unless you're actually, in that version, creating a version or coming back and editing the metadata associated with it. Question. I have a professional subscription. Can I use company name or do I need an enterprise subscription? No, you should be able to use company name. Yeah, you should be able to have your own company, even if you are the only professional subscription in that company. That's fine too. That's an important thing to mention too, because when we start talking about custom properties later and adding your own custom properties, they're company specific. So that's an important step. Make sure that you've established that company. But you should be able to do that even if just a single professional subscription. You shouldn't need any kind of enterprise, I should stress. All right, so again, this is where you're editing those workspace properties. I'll do it just one more time. Documents menu, workspace properties, and then I just expand out the main workspace and drill down into the various parts, assemblies, and so on. Here you've got description, part number, revision, state, all these other various properties. Now, a commonly asked question that I get is it possible to create your own properties? And the answer is yes. And that's, of course, a very important part of managing the company's metadata. It is done at a company level. And the advantage of that is if you create new properties, they're automatically in company-owned documents. So you don't have to distribute your custom properties. It's done automatically. But I do want to stress you can create your own custom properties, and they're associated with any company-owned documents. And that's the way it's structured. All right, so this is adding your own custom properties. And I've mentioned before, again, that I've created the document. It's a company-owned document. I've gone in and I've edited some metadata associated with it, maybe added some part numbers or descriptions. But the reality is that I need to share this with others in order for them to work on it. Right now, I'm a CAD administrator. I've created my document, but no one but me has access to it. And so this is where we decide, who has access to what at what times. So, for instance, if we jump back to our workflow, everything is in this in progress state, right? And the question then becomes, well, in our company, who should have access to the document at this state? And, in general, I'm kind of generalizing here, of course, but engineers should have access to it. But that may not be an area where I want management to have access to it. Or maybe it's not an area where I want our, a quality team to have access to, because it's just not ready for them yet, right? It's an in-progress sandbox state. So this is where, as a CAD administrator, I just go to share, and I define what kind of permissions each team has. Now, I recommend teams unless we're talking about sharing with just, a couple of individuals. As you start to get into more and more users, sharing individually just becomes tedious, especially in larger organizations. So Teams is a valuable thing because I can say, okay, we want the machine design team to have edit permissions. They can copy, they can link. They need full access, so to speak, right? I click share. Right. And I can say, well, the structural team, they need to be able to see what's going on, so they have, they have an idea of what we're doing, but we don't want them to be able to edit, right? In this in progress state. I could define that later. I could even have a manager's team or an executive's team, right, where I share with management. I give them view permissions as a certain, part of my design process. So the big thing I would stress is just the fact that Teams is a valuable tool to share with a lot of users at once in your company. So, if you wanted an easy way to share with 10 engineers on all part of the same group, I would add them all to a team, share them all at once, define their permissions in that one place. Remember, all of these can be changed. So as I change the state, let's say that we go to market with our design, we change the state to released. I would then come in here and say, well, no one needs edit permission anymore. Now it's just view, right? So now I've edited the permissions and said you're only allowed to view the document because it's in that release state. Now, as I mentioned before, there's still not a way to trigger that automatically. So, as this hits released, it automatically pulls permission from these individuals. It's still a step you have to do, but it, as you can see, is just a couple of clicks. So, changing the permissions, managing them with teams are very important things in the release management process, because inevitably you're going to want to restrict access to the document based on where it's at. And another example of a team that I would create is an approvers team, a list of individuals who are, the quote unquote approvers of design, who are capable of approving design. Then I can give them independent access to it. So maybe as it hits that review state, I want to restrict everyone's permissions except for that approvers team, right? And it's all managed via this share dropdown. Question: can any properties be copied to all? It's important to keep in mind, if you create custom properties, they are automatically in company-owned documents that you create. So you don't need to copy the property itself. Now, if forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, if you're referring to copy, like I want to copy and paste the same value into multiple places as as a part of copy and paste, yes, you can. You can shift select in the properties and type in one value, and it's going to fill everything that's selected. So you could do the shift or control select in the properties. Forgive me if I'm misunderstanding that question. Can you share with people who only have? Oh no, it's cut off. The free license. You can share with people who have the free license. They cannot edit, right? So you can share a private document with a person with a free subscription, but they cannot edit the private document. They can only view that document, right? They don't have permission to share it. They don't, so again, keep in mind, a free user cannot edit a private document. They can view it. That's the limitation. But you can share. It's just share with view. All right. So again, the sharing permissions are a very important part of this process because, I created my document. It's in the in progress state. That means the machine design team needs that edit permission so that they can do their work, right? Now, let's say that my design has progressed and we've reached a point where, we're ready to have it reviewed by someone, right? We're ready to push it into the next step in the phase. So to refresh, everything that we've done has been in this in progress state, right? Now I can push this into the pending state by changing the state of the document as a part of creating a version. And I want to stress this, whether you're, let's say that I just want to bump the revision of a single part within a document. I would still go through this process of creating a version, changing the state of just that part as part of the version, right? So whether you're changing a part in the document, an assembly in the document, or the entire document, creating a version is a necessary step. Okay. Question: can a free user with whom you shared a private document make a copy of that? No. No, that's an explicit permission, by the way. Copy or export are separate granular controls. Even in the case of sharing with a paid user, you give access to copy or not. So that's up to you. All right. So again, how do we take this from in progress into the pending state? And so the answer is, again, to assign that state in revision. The key thing I would stress is it's all a part of creating a version. So we've reached this point. Let's say that my overall document is ready for a revision stamp, or maybe it's just a single part or two. It really doesn't matter. You'd create a version, right? I'd create a version. Let's call this Rev A. I would click, very important, create version and edit properties. This is where you'll actually change the state of your design. Right, so it's the same exact dialogue we were looking at a second ago. The main difference being, if I start to drill into these parts, you can change the state. Because again, we're creating a version here, and I can alter the state of an established version. You can't do it with an active workspace. So again, to remind you, this was grayed out a moment ago. We couldn't change it, because we weren't creating a version. Now we're creating a version of, in this case, everything. So it's revision A, and I can change the state. I can change the revision from here. Now, a question, obviously, when you start getting into these more complex assemblies and parts, is can I change everything at once? The answer is yes. You can do something like a shift select a whole bunch of parts at once, and change their state to pending, right? Notice I get the little yellow flags, so I've changed all these parts in this document to the pending state. I still need to hit apply, but again, that's all it would take. Question. So if I'm changing only one part of my assembly, I have to create a new version of the whole assembly. Remember, a version is just a moment in time of the document. You're not creating a version of everything necessarily. A version is just that moment in time. And you can think of that moment in time as I'm just changing one part of my assembly. Right? You don't have to change any other properties of anything else. So again, don't think of version as I want to version everything in the document. Think of it as I'm capturing this moment in time. That moment in time, maybe I want to version the whole assembly. That moment in time, maybe I'm versioning one part within the assembly. And in that case, your version name would be part A, version B, so you kind of get the idea. But don't think of a version as I'm version controlling everything in this document. Think of it as I'm capturing this moment in time for whatever reason. And that could be changing one part, could be changing one drawing. So that's a common one that we hear often. I want to make a change to just a drawing, right? You could do that as well. Does state information export to BOM apps such as OpenBOM? Yeah, absolutely. What about other apps such as SolidWorks? No, you're not going to. The metadata isn't going to carry over into another CAD application, right? So the question then is, maybe you should discuss the difference between version and revision. Think of a version as just some moment in your document that you want to capture. A moment in time that's important. It could be just a revision change of a part. It could be the revision change of the entire application, right? Or excuse me, the entire document. So a version is just any moment in the document that you want to capture. A revision is a piece of metadata associated with the part. You could create a version and say, I have part A, now it needs to be Rev B. And I'm creating a version to change that revision of that one part, right? Or, like in our example, I could be ready to push the entire document into pending because maybe it's the document level that I want to push. Both of those are good examples of creating a version. So just keep in mind, version does not equal revision. I want to stress that because you could create a version just for a revision bump of a single drawing, and that's fine. So again, I change everything to pending. I hit the big apply. Right now, it's in that pending state. Right, I could change part numbers, revisions all at once too. The shift select or the control select are really valuable things there, especially when we start talking about revisions. If you're trying to batch apply, revision to 20 different parts at once, shift selecting or control selecting is just the easiest way to do it. But that's really it. Now I've set everything to pending. I, as the CAD admin, would come in and say, let's restrict access to the document, right? And maybe even share with a new team like approvers, and that group of individuals would then have access to the document where they can review it, comment on it if that's their role in the flow. It just depends on what they're trying to do. But again, I managed the state, the revision, as a part of creating that version, right? And now let's close this out. Let's say that we want to revision change an individual part within this. I would still go back to create version, right? And I would say housing change rev a, and I would even put maybe even review or just change rev a. That's up to you. But then I would again go in, create version, and edit properties. Go into the housing, right? In this case, casing, motor mount flange, and I would change its revision to B, or its state to pending. In this case, I'm only changing one part within the document, right? I'm only changing that one, but it still warrants creating that version, that milestone, right? So that is an example where I would just change the one. I could hit apply, close, and then we have in the history all the little changes along with the potentially big ones. And again, think of this as that timeline of the document as it's going along. Every little milestone, be it a large push through of everything in the document or individual parts, is tracked here. Right? So that is creating and managing the actual properties. The key thing I would say is, again, we're assigning the state, and then we're modifying the revision property as part of that. And as a CAD admin, I then go in and restrict the permissions to view only, or maybe even restrict the permissions altogether. Again, right? Question: how does permission management work if you only kick a single part of a larger? Forgive me, the question's cut off, but I believe I understand it. How do permission management work if you only kick a single part of a larger set to pending and it's meant to be internally reviewed? It's a good point. Right now, we don't have a way to explicitly define this tab has X permissions that are different from other tabs in the document. I will say, as I mentioned earlier, this is an area that we're working hard on right now. So you're going to see more improvements in those types of granular things. Right now, it would involve establishing, the team. I would call it the approvers team as those permissions, and then explicitly saying this is the part. There's no way today to say if model is pending, then allow access to just this part within the overall document. Right. So in short, I think the answer to your question is it's a limitation in the sense that it's shared document wide. Right. So again, I want to reiterate this. I know I mentioned this early on, but this is definitely an area that we're working on immensely, and you're going to see the fruits of that very soon. We get this question just so often. We wanted to have something out there for you if you're trying to accomplish this. But just realize that the automation end of things, where if this is this, then we do this. Those are the things that we're working on, right? And in general, making this a smoother process. Right now, you saw me set the revision, and then you saw me set the permissions. It's two different steps. Those are obvious things that we're trying to just make easier. All right. So, is there any control over who can set certain states and when they can do it? Well, you have edit and view, but those are not specific, transition, controls, so to speak. So I'm trying to think of how you might, if they have edit permission, they will be able to create a version and then therefore change the state. I can't think of a way today to restrict who can do that as part of the process. And the question then, this has been mentioned earlier too, can set permissions be tied to each state so when a drawing state changes, all permissions update accordingly? You can come back to me on that one. I know you can link to certain properties of said part in a drawing. I'm not 100% certain state is in there. I'm 90% sure it is. So forgive me. I'll check that at the end and make sure we come back to that. Can you access change states via feature script? I don't think so. Not as of today. Again, forgive me. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's limited today. Feature script, you really can't reach outside of the feature or the feature list, so to speak. So I'm pretty certain that's going to be a limitation. Will it always be the case that we cannot delete a revision, one made by mistake? I will say that it was a deliberate decision to not allow deleting a version. I would say let us know if that's a really, really big thing for you. We've obviously heard from other users that say that, but it hasn't been an overwhelming response. So I would definitely use the feedback tool and let us know if that's something you find really frustrating. I know we've had a few other users say that as well. Can we add the workflow of shop floor as in PLM? Sure. You can add any of these, and so let's get into that. The question then is, can we add workflow of shop floor? Or as is PLM, or could you add anything as part of your workflow? And the answer is yes. Keep in mind, this is kind of a generic example. In fact, this is kind of the example that everyone gets out of the box in Onshape. So everyone has these states, even if you've never used them or interacted with them, they're there, and you can set them. But of course, in a company, you're going to want to customize this, and there's going to be different steps in the process that control who has access to what. And shop floor, I think, is a good example of that. So the question then is, how would I do that? And the answer is you'd create a custom property. And this solves the question of a few different things I've seen asked. But the question, can I create custom properties? Can I create my own custom workflow states that I want to follow? And the answer is yes. As the owner or an admin of a company, you can do that. Now, these are company related. I want to stress that. So they imply that you are, the owner or an admin of a company. The neat thing about that is anybody in your company, if they create a company-owned document, it will automatically have these properties. So how would you customize the workflow for your company? And the short answer is I would create a custom property. I would go to my username. I is the CAD admin or the company admin. I'd go to my username, go to my company. You can see in this case, my company is called Midwest Machine Tech. You'll see the properties for my company. What I'll do here is create a new property, right? We can call this whatever we want. Now, I'm not going to go into too great a detail on creating properties. We've covered this in other webinars, but if I wanted a new workflow state property, and I want it to be a list of options, right? And let's say, call it start, review. So all I'm doing is building in each one of these states, so to speak, right? So now I'm creating a custom property that's a list that has these list values, and those list values can be anything that you want, right? So if you want shop floor as your list value for your state, and you can assign that, you can certainly do that. But you could create anything you want here. Now, it can be other things too. Let's say that another common one is, I have revision, but, our revisions are different. We skip X, Y, and Z, whatever it is, that is commonly skipped in revisions. I can do the same thing. I can say revision, list, A, comma, B, comma, C, comma, D, and just keep going and build out and skip those letters that are important. So you kind of get the idea here is I'm building this custom property, whatever I want it to be. Another one that I like I like to show is approver, right? I think this may be, but let's say you have multiple approvers and you want to define approver, manufacturing approver, engineering, or whatever it may be. You can say approver and choose the type user, right? And this will actually allow you to pull in a list of users and assign it to a certain user, not just a text string of their name, but their actual user name in Onshape, right? So that's another example. It could be simple things like on, off, yes, no. That's a Boolean. It could be a simple text, something like a description would be a simple text. But I think you get the idea. Another one, approve date. You could do date. You could establish a default value for your date. So again, you can really build anything you want. everyone using Onshape has certain properties already established. So the revision, the state, description, those are all default properties that are already there. But if you want more than that, you'll need to create new properties, and they'll automatically go out, and be anywhere you create, those company-owned documents. So again, you can create all the properties you want. The thing I would stress is make sure once you've created your property, restrict, what you want it to apply to. So if you're creating an approver, you may not want to approve the entire part studio, just the part and assembly, right? So just restrict the scope of what you want your property to apply to, and then make sure to set it to active, right? So again, just keep in mind, set it to active. That is kind of what turns it on, so to speak. So when it's set to pending, this is the publish state, I should stress, you can't actually see it. It isn't until you set it to active that it's going to be usable. Now, another thing I want to stress is you can't delete these, once they're created, and that's because they're used in other places. You can set them to inactive, and that will make it so that you can't see it, but you can't actually delete it. I think that's a commonly asked question. Most of the time, if for instance I wanted to change my revision, I want to create my own revision property. I'd create revision, I'd set it to my list, I'd set this to active, and then I'd go back and set the other to inactive, right? If I create a property and later decide we don't want to use it anymore, I would come in here and set this to inactive, right? So active, inactive, very important steps in the process. As you're creating it initially, it's not going to be visible to everyone until it's set to active, right? Question, how do you deal with a serial part number where we don't? The short answer is we don't right now. There's no automated way to say next part number should be part number da-da-da, based on your company's criteria. There's no way to do that as of today. That is another area that we realize is important. But the short answer is there's no way to do it today. Can these be edited after creation? Yeah. Yeah. Hold on. Let's cancel. Yes. Forgive me, I think the answer is no. I think you would have to set it to inactive, but then it's not going to be visible. I think, forgive me, I'll come back to this. I think the answer is going to be no. I'll double check this, but I think once you hit that active create, it's there. And I don't think, well, I'll come back to this. The only question I have is, can you change custom versus the default? So I'll come back to that, forgive me. Question, so you can have multiple properties with the same name as long as they're only on... You can have properties with the same name. Can we create a sequence part number or a sequence ECO number? No. There's no way to automatically generate a number that's next in your list, or next based on a rule. There's no way to do that as of today. And I think that was the question asked earlier as well, is can we do a serial part numbering that says next part is this part name based on our list? There's no way to do that as of today. I should stress there's no out-of-the-box button that I could show you that's going to accomplish that today. It is technically possible using more complicated things like the API and a custom written application, but for the sake of 90% of users out there, no, there's no button I could show you that will do that. All right, so that is creating a custom property. I do want to stress this again. It's part of being a member of a company, an admin of a company. You can come in and create your own custom properties. Make sure when you hit create that, again, it's going to propagate it to any documents created for the company by that point. So you don't have to do anything special to tell users, these are your new properties. It will automatically be there. The one thing I would stress is, as you're creating this, make sure to define edit value inversion or the workspace. So remember, state, for example, you can't edit in the workspace. You'll see it's unchecked here, but it can edit in the version. So it depends on what you're doing. Revision would be an example where I would want to be able to edit in both, depending on what I'm doing. And then the question that commonly gets asked is, can we force it to have a value? That's a commonly asked question. There is an option for required. Right. Now, another thing I would point out, this is another commonly asked question. I don't know that I have a specific example to give you, but I can do what we call simple validation. What I mean by that is, let's say that I want the user to be able to punch in a part number, but our part numbers are always between 5 and 12 digits. Let's say that that's our rule. I can create a minimum and maximum length and even a definable pattern. Now, this isn't going to automatically increment the number, which is what has been asked before, but it does force me to follow a certain structure when I punch in the part number. So I could have a pattern of PN dash da 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 da, and then it will force the user to have that same input when they enter their part number. So it's kind of a way of forcing our part numbers to have a certain kind of structure. Again, it's not quite serialization in terms of indexing a part number, but it does force them to say, okay, it's PN dash, and then our max length is 10. So if you go over that, it's going to throw an error saying, it's an invalid part number, something to that effect. So it's just a tip, and you could do this validation on a number of different things, so it's not just text. But I do want to stress you can force the property to fit within certain rules, namely, min and max length or something to that effect. Even patterns being the most useful. A lot of times companies say, I want our part numbers to be PN-4 digits, or 5 digits, or whatever the criteria is. And you could do that with this kind of validation. So that's one that I wanted to bring up. That's a commonly asked question. Okay, so that we've discussed creating those properties. I think that's really the last important thing that I wanted to mention here. I do want to bring up just some commonly asked questions that kind of tie in with this topic. The question I get asked often is, can I share revision A with a vendor? If I share view only, they're getting the latest. What if I wanted to share just revision A, right? Not the latest, in my design. You can share a link to a version. And this is something I want to stress because, again, it comes up often. If I share with someone, I don't want them looking at the latest state of the design. Well, I can left-click revision A, right, in the actual versions in history, and then grab this URL. Right, that is a link to this version. So when I'm telling them, if you want to work off of revision A, here's the link to revision A. Another commonly asked question, especially if you have like downstream PLM software, where the question is, our PLM software requires us to upload a file at this revision. Well, I can easily drop a link in rather than a file because the version will never change. Right, so I'm dropping a link to that version rather than a static file. But the key thing is versions don't change, of course, right? They're static. And you can grab the URL and use that as a tool in your PLM software, or you can use it as a thing to share with vendors, because then you're ensuring, when they open it, that they're looking at revision A, not the latest. So that's a commonly asked question. When we talk about version management, is if I share with a vendor, if I share with the shop floor, I don't want to share the latest. I want to share the last version or whatever version, in the document. So that's how I'd handle it. Just take the link and use that as the reference for their design. We've already discussed this briefly, but creating your own properties and creating your own states, the answer is yes. The key thing to keep in mind is, as a company owner or admin, all you have to do is go to your username, my account, and then choose the properties under your company. Okay? So, again, creating your own properties, creating your own states, all of that can be done here. Okay, so that is what I had planned. I am going to stick around and answer any questions. Now, again, I want to stress, recording this on October 10th, 2017, this will change. So we're all working on ways to really improve this process, make it a much easier process, less manual steps, a lot more control over it. So just realize that we're really working hard on refining this whole process, and don't be surprised if we make changes to it in the near future. So obviously I can't comment on specific dates and things, but I will say this is definitely one of our top priorities. This whole area is one of our top priorities. Now, this is, for most users out there, this is a very important thing, and that's why we wanted to come out with this. Even though we know we're working on, improving it, we wanted to give you something today, because I think a lot of users out there are wondering, how would I do this today in Onshape? So again, I'm going to stick around and answer all questions. I know there are a few things I have to come back to. So if I left you with an outstanding question, stick around. I'll make sure to get to them. But that's it, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.